very grateful to Professor Jack Collins for this paper. As you all can hear, he is actually very supportive of the work that myself and Dr. Craig are doing. And I think after reading his paper, I think that there's just one minor critique that he has, which I need to respond to. Okay, so Collins mentioned that Loke's suggestion that we could have a specially created Adam and Eve within a fairly recent history to give universal human ancestry by AD 1 cannot work, not simply as to the scientific problems, but also to the theological side. The corruption of humankind is already visible in the earliest writings we have from ancient civilizations in Sumer, Egypt, China, and probably also in the paleontological records. So we must have the origin of this corruption much earlier in order to be so widely spread, really back to the headwaters, he says. Loke seems to be happy with a much older Adam, although he has also argued the more recent model. Okay, unquote. So this is Collins' criticism. Now, Collins is right to point out that I'm not committed to a recent Adam view. Okay, so on my view, my GAE model, I defend two versions of it. One is the recent Adam version, and the other is the older Adam version. So Dr. Collins is correct to point out that I'm also happy with an older Adam version too. And by older, I mean it could be really old, right? So I'm willing to follow the evidence where it is. So for example, it could be as old as 50,000 or 100,000 possibly. But I have also defended the recent version view, okay? And by recent, what I mean, okay, so what do you mean by recent Adam, right? Now, the reason for this demarcation between recent and Adam is because when we read Genesis, for example, right, it portrays Cain to be somebody who is doing farming, and it seems that Abel is also doing, that there is also domestication of animals as well, it seems, in the Genesis record. So how do we interpret those? Okay. If we interpret it literally, as there is actually literal farming going on rather than anachronistically, as John Collins also has argued for, then we need to ask, so when did farming start? When did agriculture start? When did human beings start to have domestication, right, of animals? Now, if we look at the paleoanthropological records, right, so many scientists used to argue that it was around the Neolithic era, right, around 10,000 years ago. And so this is the recent Adam view, right? It comes from there, so as recent as around the Neolithic era. But however, we know that this scientific evidence about exactly when did these activities started in the record, actually the dates, the timeline has been constantly changing, right? So nowadays, there are some scientists who think that, okay, maybe there's evidence that people practice domestication maybe as far back as 17,000 years ago, rather than just 10,000, right? So it could be, say, for example, during it's the ending of the last ice age, just before the Neolithic era. So the timeline could go could go earlier, right? So what that means is that the recent Adam view can also go back earlier as well, but not as long back as 50,000 or 100,000. That'll be an older view, right? Because during that time there's no evidence of agriculture, at least not discovered yet. But maybe we'll discover in the future. We don't know. But these things are changing, shifting, right? But here I'm just want to clarify what does recent mean and what does ancient means. So I hope this is clear. So given these clarifications, now first of all, I'm not committed to saying that AD 1, right, is the date that everybody becomes, by then everybody has the image of God. Rather, I argue that it could be way before that. Right? When Paul makes a statement in Acts chapter 17, right? Now of course he's referring to something that's already happened. So how far back did it happen? Well, as I say, if you hold to the recent variant, right, it could go as far back as 17,000, right, maybe during the last ice age. And so it could go further back, and if that's the case, then it wouldn't face any of the scientific problems or the theological problems that Collins mentioned, right, because he mentioned about the writings of people in Sumer, Egypt, China. Now that is only in the last few thousand, right, say 5,000-6,000 years ago. But if you go further back, 17,000 at the time, descendants spread across to different parts of the world, that wouldn't be a problem. And so that would be my response, right, to Collins. I think that both the recent variant and the ancient variant both are defensible, and I see no problem with either of these. Now, on this point, I also want to say something more about my response to Michael Keas' favorite model. Because on his view, Adam and Eve were created at least 500,000 years ago, or even 1.5 million years ago, such that even earlier human-like members of Homo, such as Homo erectus, could be viewed as God's image bearers. Right? So that is Keas' favorite model. However, the problem with his model is that it fails to consider when did the image of God qualities, such as religiosity and having a relationship with the creator God, actually appear in the paleoanthropological records. Now, this consideration is very relevant given the biblical teaching that God created human beings in his image with an awareness of God himself, being able to be aware of God and to represent him to govern the world. Now, archaeological and historical evidence indicates that the worship of the creator God only began a few dozen years ago. Now, future research may or may not discover evidence earlier than that, right? So as I say, I'm happy to follow the evidence. It could be, maybe in the future we'll discover evidence 50,000 years ago perhaps. And my GAE model can follow the evidence wherever it leads, given that I'm not committed to a very strict recent Adam view. Although I think that at present, both views are defensible at this present time, given the evidence that we have at this present time. Now, however, by contrast, Michael Keas' favorite model does not have this flexibility. So my model can be flexible, I can follow the evidence, but his model cannot have this flexibility because he wants to avoid the data concerning population genetics. Now, I think that the problem with his model is that it doesn't have this flexibility and he has to go very far back. And I think that it is implausible to think that humans made in the creator God's image existed for hundreds and thousands of years, or even 1 million years. 1 million years without any evidence of recognition of the creator God until just a few thousand years ago. Right? That doesn't seem plausible to me. And therefore, Keas' favorite model scores low for fittingness with the data as a theoretical virtue compared to my model, which follows the evidence. And so given that Keas' evaluation of my GAE model in light of other theoretical virtues are based on multiple misrepresentations and also other errors of reasoning, which I pointed out previously, and given that Keas' favorite model scores low for fittingness with the data as I've established, the GAE model which I defend is more theoretically virtuous compared to Keas' view. Thank you.
All right, and the second response now will be from William Lane Craig.
Michael Keas is to be commended for not stacking the deck by choosing as a panelist an Old Testament scholar who would be sympathetic to his own views, but rather choosing a scholar like John Collins who is sympathetic with the target of Keas' criticisms. The differences between my view and Collins' view of Genesis 1 to 11 are mainly semantic. Or terminological. He's unhappy with categorizing Genesis 1 to 11 as mito-istorie, with the consequent alertness to elements of the fantastic. For, he says, while the label has some positive features in its favor, it produces troubles that we do not need to have. He thinks that the term suffers from being etic rather than emic. It represents how an outsider to Mesopotamian culture sees the stories. He says that we might be better off supposing that the Mesopotamians considered themselves to be telling history with myth-like characteristics. This is a distinction without a difference. Whether the nomenclature is etic or emic, all that is relevant is its accuracy. After considering alternative etic labels like prehistory, proto-history, and archetypal history for Genesis 1 to 11, Collins settles on rhetorical history. Now that label is fine with me so long as we recognize what kind of literature we're talking about. Collins rightly says, and I quote, "Traditional Jews and Christians recognize that Genesis 1 to 11 are historically referential while allowing for pictorial description." That is exactly my position. And I noted that Collins reciting the mere Athanasian reading of Genesis 1 to 11 is almost identical to the summary I give in the book of the central teachings of these chapters for us. The reason I prefer the label mito-istorie is because it is not idiosyncratic like these other alternatives that have been mentioned, but it connects most closely with the work of classicists and folklorists. And we respect the intelligence of Christian laymen when we do not try to sugarcoat our conclusions, but rather we state them plainly and explain them clearly.
So while it's warming up, this is a bonus feature here. The terminological only, when the slides come up, I'll show you, it is definitely more than just a terminological difference between Craig and Collins. His rhetorical history, that is, Collins is emphasizing that it's a social event and you communicate with a mixture of figurative and literal language to convey real historical events. Collins is committed to Eve derived from Adam. Craig denies that. So that's a huge difference, and it has implications for gender roles today, having a theology that's solid enough to handle that. While we're still waiting.
I think you need to set your computer on this.
Okay, there we go. So it was regarding, that Collins thinks that Eve derived from Adam happened historically, but the story includes figurative and literal language to convey that sequence of events. And Craig thinks that Eve was not derived from Adam, and that allows him to speculate about a genetically modified organism. For Eve being a GMO, basically, in his last chapter of his book, that Eve was derived from an animal, not from Adam. So it's very important to him to be able to oppose Collins on this issue. And so it's not just a terminological issue. Okay, so Craig is inconsistent in that he takes a sample from only Genesis 18 to say that Genesis 18 was theophany, God appearing physically. But he neglects to look at Genesis 17, where you have the trait of ritual. And so he's inconsistent, but he really, where the inconsistency really lies in a more substantial way is his faulty distinction between miracle and fantastic. So this is new. This is the new part here to respond to him. Let's see, get rid of that. So, according to Craig, that Gen 2 is fantastic because it's not a theophany miracle, that is, a physical appearance of God miracle. And he thinks it's not theophany because God is described as human even when not appearing. This is in his book, not in his paper, in his book. So, such as when Eve was being created. Obviously, when Adam and Eve were unconscious, they couldn't see God, right? If God appeared. Well, the same thing is happening in Genesis 18. Part of the time, when God is standing there by the tent with two angels, he's not appearing to Abraham because Abraham went into the tent. So there's part of the time, even in Genesis 18, when God cannot be appearing to Abraham. So this is this distinction between Genesis 2 as fantastic myth and Genesis 18 as real miracle fails. He's inconsistent about that. In fact, he ignores two better options regarding Genesis 2. God could have appeared in a theophany most of the time, similar to Genesis 18. Or option 2, even if it's not a theophany, let's suppose God didn't appear in a physical form, it could still be real events conveyed by a mix of literal and figurative language, such as in Deuteronomy 32, where it says of the Jews that had just finished wandering in the wilderness, that God guided them, which he did, but that they were the apple of his eye, figurative language. Both a more literal and more figurative language refer to actual real events in the desert wandering around. So Craig's fantastic conclusion that is, concluding that the trait of fantastic is in Gen 2, therefore that's the myth trait, ignores better options such as options 1 and 2. And I think his motivation for this, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is in his book he says he wants to consider the possibility that Eve was a GMO, genetically modified organism, not derived from Adam but from an advanced animal. So now Craig also says that the language of theophany is missing in Gen 2 and 3, but it is in Genesis 18, where it literally says the Lord appeared. So this is odd that Craig thinks that in order for it to count as theophany, it must literally tell us the Lord appeared or something similar to that. Whereas Poitras, who's got a book-length treatment on theophany that's well-respected, says Genesis 2 to 3 can very well show us, without telling us in a literal, explicit way, that God showed up in a physical form, such as the language of God, the description of God bringing Eve to Adam, or the walking sound that God made. What's a good way to make a walking sound? Well, maybe by having a physical body and walking, right? God could have done it another way, but he's showing us that it could have been an actual physical body, and so on. Now, Poitras says, even if this is not theophany, Genesis 2 and 3, it's definitely real events of history, which Craig denies that Eve was derived from Adam. That would be the most important denial that Poitras and Collins and I agree on, and even Loke agrees that also is compatible with Scripture, of a good reading of Scripture, that Eve could be derived from Adam. Now, Craig says that I have a literal interpretation of Genesis in his paper, and that I must harmonize this with science. Well, in a longer version of my paper that I sent in much longer ago, I give Collins-style reasons for why Gen 1 is analogical days, not literal days. And I give reasons for a regional flood, not local, that's one extreme, and not universal, but a regional flood. And I think these are easy to harmonize with science. And yet, in his same paper today, he says Keas and I agree that we should not interpret Gen 1 through 11 with literalism. That conflicts with his other statement. So there's a lot of confusion here. Now, Collins agrees with me, and he even verified this in email, that Craig has conceded too much about the historicity of Gen 2, for example, Eve derived from Adam's side. And he approved even me using this slide to quote him, that these texts really do imply the actuality of their events. Yes, they're described in literal and figurative language, but it implies the actuality of these events. Now, regarding the myth sample, Craig has understood part of what I was trying to say there. In the quotation that he quotes, that I also quote, he left out the part in bold, where this myth expert says, Greek myths are fictions, we would now say. But, of course, to the ancient Greeks, they had explanatory power. That part he quoted, the last part. But he left out the part in bold, which is evidence. I'm not mind reading. This is one of the few experts who, impolitely, against etiquette, say that, of course, we don't believe the actual event, that the event sequences of Greek mythology actually happened. And so I'm not mind reading here. It's based on evidence. And so most myth experts today don't believe in the event sequences that they're myths, that they study describe, right? That's pretty obvious. And of course, Craig similarly doesn't believe that Eve was derived from Adam. That's more of the mythos part of his mytho history. Now, Craig does say that he doesn't even apply his theory beyond Genesis 1 to 11. And he says it's an open question. There could be more mytho history, we'll see what we find. But on his own website, he says that these myth criteria don't characterize Genesis 12 through 50, and which definitely don't belong to this genre. This is utter confusion. So, and furthermore, he challenges me to have a full genre analysis that would be different than his genre analysis. But Collins and I don't think this is barking up the right tree. That there is that we think that this kind of genre analysis is too blunt a tool. It's trying to do too much in one fell swoop. Whereas Collins' more nuanced approach to interpreting the text takes into account a lot of other things, not trying to just solve everything with a genre identification. And so concludes that Eve was derived from Adam, as I do, rather than denying it like Craig does. Now as to Loke. responding to Loke, these animal spouses. Now, yes, it is core to his theory that humans mated with animals. That's the whole point, and Swamidass also. But well, anyway, that are humans. We'll get to that later. But it's core that there's some kind of interbreeding. Adam and Eve with people outside the garden. That's core to the theory.
Not animals.
Right. You relabel them as humans or something like humans or persons, whatever. So Loke says, okay, since we're focusing on Loke for the sake of this conference session, that Loke says that there's two ways it could be done, by God's will or against it. But in his book, he gives 5 reasons for plan A, God's will, but no good reasons for plan B. So I challenge his plan A. I focused on the one that he emphasized and shows how it fails to cohere with God's attributes. The animal spouse, how could that be good, given that they would have a marriage with children, would be with deficient nurturing and so on, points I made earlier. So Loke concedes, okay, let's change to plan B. It was against God's will. But he adds a new hypothesis that was not in his book, that it's a test for humanity. He's designed them so they could interbreed, but don't do it. It's just a test. Well, here the human inclination for animal sex is a result of God deliberately making us so that we could have sex with animals and reproduce, including the language bridge for sex talk and family talk. Okay? And he even thinks that this is a biologically superior way to spread the image of God, to have more genetic diversity. So in other words, God's saying, yes, I've designed all this exquisitely so they can all happen and be a better way to spread the image of God, but don't do it. This is just a sex test. Okay? This is implausible. And furthermore, this interbreeding with animals is not even needed. Because to explain current genetic diversity, if you go back to 500K or back, there's a really solid case. You don't even need interbreeding with people outside the garden or animals, whatever you want to call them. You don't need that. You don't need to have that. So now if you go with a more recent Adam and Eve, of course, then that makes it a little more challenging. But even there may be, depending on how recent you go, there could be ways to explain that diversity. It's on a sliding scale. So Loke's theory is getting more and more complicated, and I think incoherent, as he's bouncing from plan A, which was the only thing he really solidly defended in his book. I showed why it doesn't hold. Now he's booted on that and goes with plan B. Now, as far as the racist comment, of course Loke himself is not racist, but his theory is regarding ancient communities. Now he's taken a modern dictionary and says what? It defines racism as, within the human family, but different ethnic groups, and calling them inferior ethnic groups. But this recent definition of racism ignores the history of racism. In the 19th century, there were many forms of racism where it considered other ethnic groups as not even human. And scholars today routinely label that racism. So Loke's animal spouses in ancient communities do count as racism. So in conclusion, although I have one bonus slide for this, Loke, Keas, Collins, and Nathan French, Dr. French, in the end there, we all oppose Craig in regard to Genesis 2 and 3, where we think that often the text can show more than it tells by the bare words. Okay? So this literalist bare words approach that triggers the fantastic, we think, is not a legitimate approach, which is the only way that he really gets to mytho-history, because that's the only trait that really distinguishes Genesis 1 to 11 from most other parts of the Old Testament. So it's really not a strong inference at all. Now, Craig and Keas agree that Loke is pushing against a more ancient view. Of course, he's open to an older Adam, but he really wants to push for a younger Adam, because then you would need the interbreeding with people outside the garden, or animals, whatever you want to call them. Now, Loke is pushing against that by citing the absence of archaeological evidence for religion, and saying that this absence of these archaeological evidence for religion is evidence of absence. But this is a fallacy if we have good reasons to think that early religion would have not involved objects that would be likely to be preserved. And Dr. Nathan French and I have talked about this at all in terms of A&E, and Old Testament is his specialty. And it's very likely that things were rarely preserved, and you could have hundreds of thousands, even millions of years without any archaeological trace of this. And Dr. Craig and I agree that you could have a very plausible older Adam and Eve, even though they're in the image of God, without evidence from archaeology. Now, our book project, Dr. Casey Luskin, Dr. French and I, we're going to have a book. This conference session is really helping us. I'm so grateful that you guys are helping us to think through these things to make sure that in the book we finally have the very, very best arguments. One bonus slide and I'm done. All right, now, Dr. Craig has said several times that he doesn't apply his theory beyond Genesis 1 to 11. But in his book, he refers to Genesis 2 and 3. He says, you need to interpret this, understand this, in the larger context of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and even, of course, even beyond that. And he says such a wider perspective is necessary if we're to do our job responsibly. Well, for him to do his job responsibly, he should have been consistent with his own advice and applied his theory to Exodus, and then it would have turned up all 10 traits. Now, regarding the Exodus not being primeval, he quotes the same person that I quote, who says, well, it could have been myth, it could have been this. Well, primeval is a relative term. The primeval, the little yellow star is on my timeline on the bottom there. If you judge it from the time the Old Testament was mostly completed by some scholars, let's say the 5th century, then the Exodus was 800 years before that, and that would seem very remote to them. And furthermore, Craig calls Genesis 1 to 11 Israel's foundational myth. But wait a minute, he doesn't mean Israel as a person, he means the nation. When was the nation founded? At the Exodus. There was no nation before then. And the text of Exodus even says that. Israel's, let my firstborn go. You know, my firstborn nation. So, there we go. That's my final slide. Thank you.